Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening. So, you would think after the horrible massacre in Florida, Parkland, that this would raise eyebrows not only for talking about the gun violence issues and how to handle those, but it has also caused people who take it as an opportunity to joke about the incident and to make crank calls and hoaxes and to create and incite fear in local communities and schools across the nation. So here I saw an article that was pretty intriguing, but I, thought that this is really sad because you would think that people would think, this is really sad. We don't want to repeat this horrible incident. But unfortunately, you see the title, it speaks for itself. It says, after Florida shooting, more than 600 copycats threats have been targeting schools. So, what I thought was interesting is that, most of the parents received, if you have the parent that have their phone um, where they can send calls from all the school districts or certain school districts where your kids attend. They'll send these electronic calls alerting to you all of the different developments that have been made or all the alerts now since this shooting that happened. So it has happened here in California where they have sent around calls to multiple parents to alert them of what the protocols would be in an incident such as this, unfortunately. So it goes on to say after Florida shooting, more than 600 copycat threats have targeted schools. And so this article was put out by a Crystal Hayes of USA Today. And so it's just a sad incident. So it goes on to talk about that incident that night or that evening, rather. It says, breathless and whimpering or whispering through the phone, a 13-year-old student calls for help from her Ohio school. Help, help, she says between the whimpers. He's got a gun. He's got a gun in my mouth. So anxiety was already running high. It had been only a week after the deadly Parkland, Florida shooting. So police dispatchers then got 3 other calls from a Withrow University High School in Cincinnati, but it all was just a hoax. So that was one incident. But there were many other incidences that they had reported that were either hoaxes or they had to really investigate to find out if it was credible or not. So it goes on to read, it's a stunt that other teens and kids across the nation have pulled after the tragedies, creating fear in communities and bringing costly investigations by police and federal agents who have no choice but to take the threats with deadly seriousness. And so some would say, well, it creates this panic and hysteria, and some kids take it as excitement, while some take it as, I'm afraid to go to school. So the rise in threats after the high-profile mass killing is nothing new, but the incidences are hard to quantify because they're tracked nationally by any government agency. A review by USA Today has published accounts, however, that paints a clear picture of the growing problem that is no joke. And so more than 130 threats were reported and analyzed by the USA Today network in the 9-day span after the Valentine's Day shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High in Parkland, Florida. It left 17 dead. Also, nonprofits such as Educators School Safety Network have compiled a list of threats using news media reports. And so the group found that a jarring 638 threats targeted schools in the 2 weeks after the Parkland shooting, a number that they say is probably on the low side. Copycat shooter school threats since the high school shooting in Parkland, Florida, have been 638 reported threats targeting schools across nations between February 15th to February 27th this year. And so those are the incidences in each state. And so there's a map here showing it. And so this is in USA Today, if you're looking for this article. So following the deadly rampage in Florida, panic swept the schools from Maine to California, leading to lockdown, school closures, deployment of bomb-sniffing dogs. So the dramatic rise in threats is from 10 to about 70 a day, and it has left school administrators and authorities walking a fine line in dealing with the threats' credibility. So it's also worried parents who fear sending their kids to school and shine a spotlight on the legal battles and debates over the penalties that kids should face. So after the root of the problem, experts say that the students who are too young to realize the severity of the comments that they're making on social media and a host of things. So there are usually two common traits of these individuals, said Mary Ellen O'Toole, a former FBI profiler. They're young and their judgment is very poor. And I mean, a brain isn't fully formed until it's in its early 20s. So she's suggesting that the maturity level of these teens, they don't take things seriously. So they think it's a hoax. And then they had one incident that I'm going to read, talks about a school, just a girl didn't want to go to school. So she called the school and created a panic. And it was just so that they could take the day off. So then it is also people who want to be disruptive and affect the school from operating. So a 911 call at Withrow High School lockdown was February the 22nd. And so police arrested a 13-year-old student after multiple 911 calls prompted a lockdown at Withrow High School on February 22nd. The audio was provided. It was in Cincinnati from the Cincinnati Police Department. And so it goes on to say, in Texas, there have been 55 reports, and that was the state that had the most threats since the shooting. So next in line is Ohio, then California, Florida, and Pennsylvania, according to the data from the Educator School Safety Network, which not only tracks such incidences, but also it trains schools on how to handle those incidences. Because of the threats, at least 33 schools have closed and more than 15 others have been on lockdown, according to the review of the incidents reported across USA Today's network, which encompasses more than 100 news organizations nationwide. So some threats were real, and law enforcement was able to thwart the plot before it came to fruition because larger numbers of scares weren't credible, meaning a person suspected of making the comments wasn't planning to harm any others and didn't have the access to the weapons to do so. So it's not funny, and I think this should end, said Bailey Campbell, a student at Central York High School in Pennsylvania. I want to go back to school and I want to finish my senior year. Her high school, along with others in the region, was closed for 3 days because of a threat sent by a middle school student. Authorities say the student made the threat simply, this is the one where the kid didn't want to go to school. So some kids will make the threats because they know the school will be on lockdown and the kids won't have to go to school. So seeing closures like that in Pennsylvania gives the student a sense of power, O'Toole said, which is huge for kids of that age. Before taking intense action, it's important to track the threat and see whether the person behind it is even has the means to act on that threat. So if the threat doesn't result in some effect on the school, the students feel like they've failed in that threat. Thus, it discourages the behavior, meaning that if that kid attempts to make the threat, but there's nothing really credible to back it up, and they assume that the person is just crank calling, and they don't, react on that incident. They just do their protocols to be precautious, but they don't, feed into too many of these hoax threats that maybe it will lessen the threats. So most reported threats aren't followed by shootings or attacks, is what they're saying. So authorities have been going back and forth about those issues and how to deal with those threats because you don't know which one is going to be a real threat versus a hoax threat. So on the other hand, the arrest could leave a scar on a student's future as well. So they've also put that into consideration, especially if a kid is not really have access to weapons to call on the threat as being legitimate. So, but the threats might cease if a hard approach is taken. So they're saying if they use Parkland shooter and people who really do carry out the threats and they have a harder approach on those particular individuals, that it'll be less likely a chance of others to try to carry out even hoax threats. So even the jail as a penalty threat have been prevalent for decades and no signs of stopping. So they're saying threats, even when kids are knowing that they could possibly face jail time, it hasn't ceased an end to the hoax calls. So kids will still try to attempt to do that in order, to not get caught and to see how far they can go with it. So after the massacre at Columbine School in 1999, hundreds of threats were sent to schools across the country, leading to more than 350 arrests. So Broward County has been under the microscope since that shooting incident in 1999, and the news, media, and lawmakers have scrutinized a nationwide program in schools that aim to keep students from serving jail time for minor offenses. So the school gunman, Nicholas Cruz, was not part of that program, but some have criticized it, including Senator Marco Rubio, who has said it delays and discourages law enforcement from being alerted to dangerous students. So Amanda Klinger, Director of Operations for Educators, could be dampening with a few measures. Chief among them would be schools communicating with students about the severity of threats and parents reinforcing the message at home. So everyone knows you don't say bomb in an airport. So we have to get that point with the kids across on the issue, she said. So we need to make it clear that this isn't okay to do this, and it is incredibly serious. So I could understand how kids would think, oh wow, bomb threat, and then kids will go bolting out of the school, but it's horrible. But there are some kids that will pull pranks like that, of course, unfortunately. So pointing out the consequences of a joke, whether it is jail time or expulsion, could also help, but the school privacy laws keep much out of the public eye. On average, threats usually continue about 10 to a 14-day period after a major incident has occurred through the social media and news cycle that could be even longer. So threats after the shooting in Florida have already continued past 2 weeks and caused panic and confusion in nearly every state. So social media has only worsened the headaches of the threats. Now, it travels quicker because they have all these different social media sites that teenagers are, drawn to. And so it easily spreads across from state to county lines. So sometimes even vague posts such on social media can lead to a panic. A post in January that included photos of guns with the caption reading, "Don't go to school tomorrow" at MHS students, spread across schools with the same initials in Florida. So schools closures before it was found to be a hoax. So after the shooting in Florida, the same Snapchat threat was reported to authorities in several other states. So it goes on to say that social media is really wreaking havoc at the point, said John Scolia, the Hanover Public Schools superintendent in southern Pennsylvania. There is so much rumors, things flying around from one district to another throughout Pennsylvania. At least 32 threats were reported, and there have been results of closures, lockdown, bomb sniffing dogs, extra police on campus. Such changes have a psychological effect on students and school administrators. So Kenneth Trump, he said that, who heads the National School Safety and Security Service, a school safety consulting firm. So anxiety is already high after witnessing a tragedy such as the Parkland shooting because they think it could happen to them, he says. So it doesn't matter where something is happening, Trump said. Teachers and students still need to feel that, feel like it's in their backyard. So I guess they need to see how serious it is. So schools aren't the only ones feeling the effects of the threat. The increasing numbers after the Florida shooting has law enforcement agencies across the U.S. strapped, going to schools, after schools, to decipher whether there is any real threat to children seeking an education. So if this is the new normal, I'm going to need about 2 more investigators just to do this, said John Hall. So a chief deputy for the Lee County Sheriff Department in Mississippi, the world doesn't stop turning. I guarantee you, I'm preaching to the choir of a law enforcement agency because they're thinking the same things. Many schools are guilty of overreacting to threats because of the fear and worry from parents that accompany them. Schools of falling pranks are, so some kids are just pranking the schools, and so that's also a worry as to whether how credible it is and how much it's just a hoax, and then the severity of the whole issue. And many experts say that the shooting in Florida, it is an opportunity for schools to review how they assess threats and their plan for the emergency action situation. So it's a chance to make sure that the infrastructure in place is properly assessed to an incident and to communicate news to news media that the public's, that news to the public before the rumor spreads like wildfire. So I already know what this is going to say, but it's saying, and according to Trump, it is easy for schools to have a knee-jerk reaction, like evacuations, said Trump. They need to assess first rather than react, not the other way around. So they need to assess the situation first rather than react. So that is pretty much the bulk of the article. And I just thought it was interesting because you would think that it would be on the reverse, that people would, at least that's what I was thinking, that maybe people would be a little more alert. They'd be more conscious as to how people felt. But unfortunately, you have kids that, young people and people that look at this as an opportunity to prank call and do hoax calls. So I'm going to leave this video at this title, and thanks for listening.